Well, if you're buying or selling a house, the rules have changed. It's all part of the settlement of a lawsuit against the National Association of Realtors that complained of long-held practices driving up commissions and harming sellers. Now, the NAR admitted no wrongdoing, but the $418 million settlement ushered in some big changes that took effect this weekend. And joining me now to explain the changes is Christie Moore. She is Region 1 Director for Kentucky Realtors. Christie, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Shelley.
To talk about this that I think a lot of people don't realize really what's going on here. So help us understand what's happened. I understand probably the biggest changes in commissions, how the seller and buyer's agent are paid. Talk about that. What are we seeing different now?
So this weekend has been a crazy weekend because for people that are just now learning about it, when they went to tour a home, whether it was virtually or in person, they had to have a buyer representation agreement signed before you can tour a house or see it virtually. That's new. That's not something that people are used to doing. They're scared to sign on the dotted line for a contract.
Now, sellers typically do sign on the dotted line, but a buyer, you typically can just kind of look around, but you can't do that anymore. Right.
So what the nuts and bolts of this is going to be is that as a seller, you get to pick out who you want as your agent, your representation. And that person has a fiduciary responsibility to you to make sure they're looking out for your best interest and that they're working for you. You interview them, you talk about your commission, your compensation. And the biggest change was that whatever the X number was that you were charging them to do business, the brokerage was able to say, okay, we take this commission, this split, this percentage, and then the brokerage was able to say, we're going to give S away to the buyer agent. So they were in charge of that. Now it's really going to come back to the seller can still pay commission, and we suggest that they still do pay compensation to a buyer agent. It's just the difference is that they can decide to pay their agent only. You know, we're only going to pay you this much for you representing us, and we want the buyer for their representation to pay their own agent for that representation.
So the buyer has his or her own agent and the seller has his or her own agent. Now, typically in the past, I know you probably don't want to get into specific numbers, but I think it will help people at home understand that in the past it's been between like 5 and 7%. A seller would go on top of the price of the house to pay both the seller's agent and the buyer's agent.
Correct.
And now, is that completely negotiable? What happens now?
It has always been negotiable. So it really isn't any different. I think that the way that's being presented is scaring people because commission has always been negotiable. And it's that, you know, and putting numbers to it, like you said, you know, if I said I work for X commission, and we'll say that it's 6%, just for people to understand. Then I was going to say, okay, Shelley, to list your house, I'm going to do it for 6%, but I'm going to give away 3% of that to the buyer agent. You're still paying 6%, but I was getting 3 at my brokerage and I was giving away 3. You can still do that. That has not changed. But what's going to change is that you could say, no, I'm only going to do 3%, and then the buyer can pay their own agent, or depending on what price they give me, then that could be worked in and negotiated in the deal. So that's all open. So I think that the biggest thing, though, for buyers who want to go tour a home, that's going to be the biggest difference because the seller side is still basically the same. And you would say yes, and I would tell you, Shelley, if you're going to list your house, to cast the widest net is going to be to pay a buyer agent. To keep that there because it's hard, especially where we are at in the tri-state, for those buyers to bring that much to pay an agent. It's going to stifle your house in the market. So go on ahead and put that in there, and let's do business as normal. But the main difference is that we cannot put it in the MLS anymore. So whereas
explain that. What
does
that
mean? It's called the multiple listing service. So that was where realtors and people in the service industry were able to go in and say, okay, I got the 6%. That's what I was, and this is what I was going to give you, is the 3%. And you're able to see that in the MLS system. So I knew when I was going to show this house that I was going to get 2.5, 2, 3, 3.5%.
But now you can't.
Now it's not shown. We can no longer advertise it in the MLS or anything tied to the MLS. So, but we still can put it on, you know, I would now have to call a realtor and say, hey, is your seller offering commission or compensation to a buyer agent? And if that person says, no, they're not, my buyer says, well, I'm not paying, we may not see those houses.
So how do you think this is going to affect the housing market itself and people wanting to buy, too?
I think that once once everybody calms down. and I could tell you as a buyer, and here's what I say to buyers right now is this. Right now, before you get to the house, go on ahead and call an agent that you want to work with, just like the seller does. They call an agent, they go over everything, they have a consultation. I know sellers who may meet with 3 or 4 people before they decide who they're going to work with. As a buyer, you have that responsibility, and you can do that now too. Call 2 or 3 agents, see who you like, who you want on your team, instead of just showing up at the house and saying, oh, I love the house, but you may not like your agent. It may be a rough go at it. Okay. So call an agent, interview an agent, sit down with them, do a consultation, and let them walk you through. Okay. That way you can go ahead and sign all the paperwork before you ever get to the door, because it's very hard if you showed up right now at the door and I have to give you all these papers. And you're going to see where you have to sign a consumer guide that's going to tell you how I can represent you, and then another paper saying what we decided to be the representation, then a 2-page buyer representation agreement that's going to say the buyer, if the seller doesn't pay me, that you're going to pay me.
Gotcha.
And that's the scary part.
So it kind of protects everybody all the way around. We are unfortunately out of time. There's so much to talk about here, but a real quick question I have for you though is open houses, usually that's just open to everybody to walk in. Does a buyer have to have that contract in place before they go to an open house?
That is the caveat.
Oh, really?
So when you go to the open houses, you can go open. You don't have to have representation. Okay. So if you're wanting to look at houses, that is a perfect opportunity to go without that fear of I've got to sign something. Okay. So, but to see it and make offers on it, you're going to have representation.
Then you have to have representation.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, you sure are.
Christie Moore, thank you so much for explaining some of this for us.
You're welcome.
We may have more questions along the way, so we may have you back for that.
Yeah,
thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Shelley.
Well,